Hello everyone and good evening. We're going to go ahead and get started. Everyone should be currently muted if you're joining us by phone or by computer. As you have questions throughout the presentation, please drop them in the chat box and we'll address them at the end. I just want to say thank you for joining us for this evening's nutshell discussion. If this is your first nutshell, welcome. If you joined us before, welcome back. We can't wait to see what amazing wisdom Eliza brings to us tonight. My name is Katie Adams, and I'm the Research and Demonstration Farm Manager at the Savanna Institute. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do. The Savanna Institute is a nonprofit organization based out of Madison, Wisconsin, and Central Illinois, focused on agroforestry research and education. We believe that widespread agroforestry can help restore ecosystems, build resilience, and support strong economies of cooperation between farmers, researchers, and perennial industry builders. And we do this through a variety of avenues. We host on-farm field days, and there's still a few left for this year, so look on our website. Offer print and online resources focused on agroforestry practices, land access and lease structures, and the basis of establishing tree crops. And all of that is available on our website for free. And we're also building a network of research and demonstration farms across Central Illinois and Southern Wisconsin. We're also excited to have our first agroforestry apprenticeship cohort, and these nutshells are a part of that awesome educational component of what we do. I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Hegner Family Foundation in North Central Sayre. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to bring you these discussions for free. So now let's get on to the main event. I am super honored to welcome our presenter for this evening, Eliza Greenman of HogTree in Leesburg, Virginia. Eliza is a trained heirloom orchardist who decided that incorporating animals into her management systems would be a good idea. She's obsessed with the idea of horticultural timing and getting trees to drop fruits and nuts in a sequence order. And I've seen part of her presentation and I'm excited to see more. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Eliza, who's joining us by phone and computer. So give me 1 second to switch that over.
All right. Thanks, Katie. Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. I gave a presentation with Dana Vertnesnika let's see, last year sometime, and we discussed like basics of our theories basically on like pasturing pigs, and I launched into my very nerdy drop schemes in that webinar. So if you want to learn more about that, I would say look on the Savanna Institute's YouTube page and pull up that webinar. I will mention it from time to time on here, but I will not get into the nerdy, nitty-gritty details like I did in the last presentation. So today's presentation is more so focusing on orchards and integrating livestock and like all the different, well, some different fodder potentials, and just to get you thinking about how to move to the next step. Okay, so I want to give you, okay, so just for brevity's sake, fodder in this scenario is food for livestock, and that means like leaves, tree leaves, bushes, fruits, nuts, grasses. Those are generally what I'm going to be talking about today. So when I say fodder, I'll either mean like things that drop from the trees or things that we cut from the trees. I will have a very specific perennial bent. Actually, I'll only have a perennial bent. I don't talk about annuals ever. I don't grow annuals. It's just not my thing. And so we'll go from there. All right, a little bit about me. And the way this is going to work, actually, this talk today, is I'm going to launch into like how I came about with this thinking process, and then I'm going to launch into thoughts and things I think that are good ideas, and things you should ask me about and things you should practice. Okay, so about me, I have a degree in forestry, and so I spent 3 years after college like tromping around in the wilderness, where I really got a bigger appreciation for trees. My focus started to switch from growing trees for paper and toilet paper and lumber to fruit-producing trees during that time, and I never really looked back once I found growing fruit trees and nut trees. Okay, and so when I was on like this crazy island in Maine, and I was pruning this tree, and that's when I felt like instant deep passion in love with what I was doing, and it just happened. And so I became this crazy like apple freak, and I wanted to prune everything everywhere. And after a few years of pruning things and trying to get the basics of orcharding under my belt, I entered into an apprenticeship, and actually it was like a journey person through the Maine Organic Farmers and Gardeners Association, or MOFGA. I entered into a journey person position working with Francis Fenton, who's pictured here. He wanted me to call him Frank most of the time, and Frank was 97 years old when I went to go work with him. He was third generation of a very long line of orchardists, and so it was a learning process for us both. He had never lived with a 20-something-year-old woman, and I had never lived with a 97-year-old man. He died in 2015, just 3 months shy of 100 years old, but he plays a big part in how HogTree came about. His orchard had 120 apple cultivars, and none of them were in order in the orchard rows. And when I mean in order, I mean like they didn't bloom in order and they didn't drop in order. And so both of those are recipes for very, very hard management. And this is something you should absolutely think about if you're planting orchards, if you are top working orchards, all of that. You have to think about efficiency. And so if you have trees if you want to spray your trees and you're thinking about like an IPM way of life, then you're going to want to have your trees blooming in order, or else you're going to run all over the place and not get it, and it's going to take you 10 times the amount of time to get it done. But if you want to harvest efficiently, you want to have them according to drop date. This is something that I'm very into, and like I said earlier, you'll find that on Maya and Dana's presentation from last year. Okay, so things that Francis used to say are that the apples have to be perfect. To him, they had to be beautiful, cosmetically beautiful. Yet he grew 120 varieties of apples. Some look like potatoes. Some had, just from the way they were, they didn't look like those orbs of perfection that you find in the grocery store. And so I think he kind of was resentful a lot of the time because people weren't buying them. They didn't know what special powers these apples had, and they were used to the grocery store apples. So we didn't sell much off the farm, though we had a huge diversity. Ugly will never sell. Francis was a product of the Green Revolution. He went from a time where he did everything by hand to a time where everything could be attained by spray. And once everything could be attained by spray, he thought, this is the life. Look at how much more time I have these days. And then he would also try and convince me out of all this orchard work, saying, why don't you go work at Olive Garden or become an HVAC technician or whatever was on the TV at the time. Oh, goodness, what is happening? All right. So one day with working with Francis, my personal protective equipment tore on my back. I was spraying fungicide. Fungicide funneled down my back and into my legs and all over, soaked into my clothing, and I got poisoned. I was sick for a week, very sick for about a week. This was Captan we were spraying just for fungal infections. And during that time of feeling awful, not knowing, if I would have cancer down the line or whatever, I really started to think strongly about why I was doing what I was doing. And it became important to me to not ever put anybody at risk of this sort of intoxication and and sickness. That's not part of my ethics. I don't want myself to get sick. I don't want anybody else to get sick. And so I started to think about all the different, like, how can I be better? You know, if Francis says this is the only way, then what if I can find some disease-resistant apples so I don't have to spray? And so from there, I went to Kyrgyzstan, Central Asia, genetic homeland of apples and 70% of all temperate fruits. And really my mission when I was there was to collect as many seeds as possible from fruit species that I had import permits for in order to place some hope in growing some fruits in the future that were low spray, that didn't require fungicides. And so when I got there, it was incredible. And I was never the same again. So what you see here pictured are basically all the trees that don't look like Leland cypress are apples and walnuts and cherry plums, and it's really Eden. The further you go up into the mountains, they become pure pear forests. Below this point, you find apricots and pistachios and almonds and all sorts of things. But what you see in this picture is predominantly an apple, pear, hawthorn, cherry plum, roses forest. And this is in this picture is of Arslan Bob, which is kind of in more southern Kyrgyzstan. It's a very long car ride from Bishkek Airport. That's rough and bumpy and a little bit scary, but also the most beautiful car ride ever. All right, so what did I find? These apple walnut forests dominated the landscape, and you know, when I first went, I was like totally on the permaculture train at this point, and I was like, food forests, like crazy, chaotic guilds, and everything supports one another, and it's just going to be like a jungle of wildness, and I couldn't be more wrong. When I got here. Sure, there was a ton of diversity, but I learned that this has been managed. These forests had been managed by humans, and they had been managed by livestock for hundreds and hundreds of years. And this is what that relationship looks like. It's essentially a wild orchard. And so I kept going through. You know, my whole outlook on this changed, and so I started seeing all the different examples of how they were using livestock to manage these orchards, essentially, which is what they were. And so this is a picture of a cow. You can see on the, I think I can have a pointer using this. So this right here, it's fencing, but you can see here that they would just pile up brush, usually hawthorn brush. They would pile up, and they would use that to keep the cattle in. And that's mostly what you would see. So like instead of fencing, that I'll talk about a little bit later, you would just see wild like brush and debris and whatnot, and that would keep the animals in. Also, just to say, these forests were, here I'll go back to, these forests were, of course, under Soviet control for a while, and during that Soviet time block, they divided these forests, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of acres. They divided these forests into a grid, and from that grid, they would lease out, you know, little squares, and for X amount of money. And so here, you know, in any forest situation, it's really important to think about, when I talked about drop times before, it's really important to think about like when things are going to be ripe. And so, gosh, I don't know what's happening here. Okay. So like when they leased out these little grids, you know, families had to learn which walnuts were dropping in, say, like late September, which walnuts were dropping in early October, which walnuts were dropping in late October. And so you end up with all this little, you know, polka dot of information across the landscape of people, you know, intimately knowing their scenarios. And so I just say this because if you are somebody who's planted a 100-acre or 140-acre or whatever food forest with all sorts of, seedling trees, and I know that you can't harvest it all, and so maybe go the Soviet route and grid it out and lease those little parcels to people who can help you gain that information. All right, so back to here. This was a cow in an apple, basically an apple walnut forest, and how this works to me. So my guide who was translating for me was telling me that it's all sort of a very sustainable process. I'm sorry, guys. My arrow button is really sensitive. Okay, so basically, and I made a GIF about this that I'll play in just a second, but basically walnuts have juglone. Juglone releases, walnuts have a chemical called juglone, and juglone is a very volatile compound. You can smell it. So juglone as a volatile compound will detract insects from coming near. Some insects are sort of used to it and still do come near. And so anyway, in the canopy, walnuts and their juglone volatile compounds tend to keep bugs off of the apples and bugs off of the other fruits like hawthorn that might be growing. When a branch or two drops from the walnuts or leaves or even like some, aborted fruits, the cattle come along and they'll eat that. And that is walnut is a known dewormer. Here in this scenario, it's Carpathian walnut, white walnut, an English walnut, and so it's got a lesser amount of juglone, but still the premise stands. So the cows are getting dewormed naturally by being in this forest. And then if there is an apple that has a bug, the apple tree will drop that apple, the cows will eat that apple, and that disrupts the life cycle. And so then also the cattle are grazing the grass. And that's the grazing of the grass is intentional so that they can have so that the people can have an easier walnut harvest so they can see the walnuts. And also the cattle are fertilizing the trees. So you're getting a lot of things here. You're getting an organic meat. You're getting pristine fruits. You're reducing pest cycles. You're fertilizing the trees. There's just a lot of amazing things going on, and all this plays into what I have to say here in a minute. But I want to play you this 15-second GIF I made today, which I'm proud of, which is cattle eating walnuts. It's going so fast, oh my gosh. But basically, it's just what I described. It's natural wormer, it's fruits, it's meat, it's fertilization, it's all of that. Okay, just to say, this place isn't without problems. The populations are booming really throughout the Muslim world, populations are booming. And so overgrazing is becoming a problem as the demand for more meat rises. And also there's a lack of natural regeneration because of overgrazing. Nothing can really get established. This is in a wild scenario. What we're talking about today are orchards, which we humans plant mostly. So anyway, we'll go from there. All right, so I got home and I was like, oh my God, my whole idea of an orchard it has changed. Like I need to live wholesomely and like in tune with livestock and my management, and what do I do? So I got some pigs. These are American guinea hogs that I first started out with, and I will say I've had pigs my whole life, but that means I had a miniature potbelly pig named Ophelia, and she's still alive. She's made between 21 and 23 years old. We're not sure. We can't find the records. Oldest pig in the world, more than likely. But So I got these pigs, and I started doing some experiments. So I put the pigs in the orchard. Over on here, you can see, even though it's a shortened picture, they started tilling within the orchard row. And then I put them over here just to see, like, I was doing plot trials to see how fast they would, this number of pigs would till sod. And so I could put them into an orchard based on that sort of square footage, given like pig weight and all of that. And you can see on the other PowerPoint presentation that I gave with Dana that I have a rough, and it's very conservative per pound pig per square foot per day calculation that I use for moving pigs. And that came both from Walter Jeffries, but also it came from these little experiments here. All right, so I was thinking when working them into my orchard, like I was thinking back to Francis. I was thinking about like all the problems that we had and all the ways we treated them. So we had pest issues. What did we do? We sprayed various insecticides. We had fungal issues. What did we do? We sprayed fungicides. Blah, 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 blah. If we had to spray herbicide right within the tree row because grass, the growing mentality, and that's just how it is these days, is that grass is evil if it's growing underneath the trees. And so anyway, it was just, there were a lot of issues, there are a lot of conventional solutions, and what I saw from Kyrgyzstan was that perhaps some of these issues could be ticked off with the presence of livestock. First of all, we're going to talk about pests. Plum curculio is the #1 pest. This is mostly, I'm sorry if any of you are on the West Coast because you don't have any problems, but for all of us on the East Coast, some of my orchards are in what my orchard friends call the final frontier, the mid-Atlantic. So we have everything. We have pests. We have insane fungal pressure. It's just very difficult. And one of the main pests to harm fruit growers, or really, yeah, apple growers, but this extends into other fruit as well, on the East Coast is plum curculio. It can be responsible for destroying 80% of your crop. And that is mostly due to reoccurring life cycles within the growing season. So it only takes, a plum curculio's life only takes like 55 days to go from egg to new adult to start it all over again. And so in my area and further south, you can get plum curculio problems that are, you can get 3 life instars in a season or more maybe. And it'll just destroy what you're trying to do. And so here, my little plum curculio sketch, I'm just going to go through the life cycle really quick. So when the apples hit around 10 millimeters, you need to cover them with something. If you're going to cover them, you need to like say you're going to use Surround, which is a kaolin clay. You want to spray Surround right before they hit 10 millimeters because that seems to be like the radar for plum curculio. They're like, this apple is big enough. I'm gonna go lay my egg in it. So the female weevil, this one right here, she arrives, lays an egg, which is indicated by a sting. It's often like a crescent moon or a half moon on the apple. So she deposits her eggs in this area right here, and then that little larvae is making his, like, if it doesn't get like crunched by the apple, so the apple can outgrow the larvae and like smush it to death. But if it does not, this little larvae like ekes his way to the center of the apple and eats the seeds. And even though they're embryonic seeds, it eats the seeds. Once the seeds are eaten in the apple, the tree decides, I don't want you anymore. Your main goal is to grow more apples for me, and so since you can't do that, you're getting cut off, and the tree literally does that. the apple drops to the ground. And once dropped to the ground, the larvae moves into the soil to pupate, and then in 4 to 5 weeks, the pupa develops into an adult and comes out of the soil and starts the whole thing over. And so organically speaking, the number one thing that people do is spray Surround, a kaolin clay, on the apples when they're 10 millimeters. However, conventional people use Imidan, often use Imidan, which is like a broad spectrum insecticide. You're killing everything. And they'll, under the guise of IPM, they'll say, okay, well, we've got this timed perfectly that we can just bomb this orchard, and death will be minimized, but we can't say we won't kill everything. And so I've never been okay with that. And to be honest, Surround is really a pain in the ass to deal with. And so I still use it to an extent, but it gets on everything. It gunks up everything. So I stuck pigs in the orchard. And I have pictures of this, but I decided today that I was just going to draw all these pictures. And so depending on where you are, in like New England, this is called June drop. So that when the tree decides to let go of the apple or whatever fruit, but usually I'm talking about apples here, but this life cycles continue for other fruits. June drop in New England, it's a May drop in the mid-Atlantic, and further south, like a late May drop in the mid-Atlantic, and then further south, just keep eking it back. So June drop is just when the apples are let go by the tree, they fall on the ground, and they begin, and days later, they pupate into the soil. And so that's when I have found pigs to be an amazing tool. And so if you are you can run your pigs through. You could also use geese. You could use whatever you think is going to pick up these apples and go for it. Because right now, right when these fruits are this size, they are that's when they're really hungry for fertility as well, because the tree is just trying to pump whatever it can into these fruits. And so you can stick, most animals are okay, if they're going to eat this fruit, which is small, most animals are okay to stick under the tree. This is a picture of me shaking the tree to help it along. You might want to shake each branch, of course, and get those apples to drop. You might be surprised by how many drop, but also this can be a more natural thinning for you as well. Just having pigs during this period of time can reduce the life cycle of plum curculio by 80%, which is crazy. And so just think about that. Like, that means you don't have to deal with them again for the rest of the year, because whatever life cycles keep continuing, it's not enough to cause a huge amount of damage. So just incorporating livestock in that way, being smart, like using integrated pest management with livestock, I think is a great thing. And there are some people doing that aside from me. This is a picture of the old way they used to do it when they didn't have insecticides, or maybe they did, but they weren't using them in this picture. They got like 7 people to hold tarps. I mean, it was nuts. And then they would shake the tree, and all the plum curculio drops were on this tarp, and then they would just dispose of them. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about, let's go back here real quick. Oh, I don't think I had that slide. Oh, here we go. All right, so we talked about pests. I'm only talking about plum curculio for this one, but now we're going to get into some other issues. So fungicides we might mention towards the end. I probably won't get into that. We'll mention bacterial problems. We'll also mention herbicide, or at least competition from grass. But right now we're going to talk about fertility. All right, so usually when you've got, like, fertility can't be underestimated. You know, like a lot of the times if your trees are healthy, this is the reason for, you won't get diseases. You won't get as many diseases, at least. You won't get as many fungal attacks. Like, everything is a lot better off if you can start with the right fertility in your orchard. And usually, and somewhat unfortunately, when you do a soil test with like a local extension agent or whatever, they give you like some macronutrients. And then you can like pay extra for the micronutrients, but they're all based on, what all these soil tests are based on is something that I find to be a little bit scandalous, because they're based on like Red Delicious apples, which are, or if you're doing apples or whatever, which the genetics are so great and vast on fruits that I don't think, I'm getting into a tangent here. I'm not going to let myself, but anyway, just know that all of these are just basing off of, around their estimates if you get a soil test. And so in terms of actual need. All right, so, but for time's sake, there's nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, NPK, boron, and calcium. All right, most of these are expensive, or they are chemically extracted or made, and so they're not natural, really. And so for me, like, I want fertility to be as natural as possible. It also takes a lot of time to apply this fertility, and so it's necessary, for me at least, to try and get animals to do that job if I can. So here's a little sheet. This was by a Japanese university that made this up, and this is actually for a mulberry orchard, but they went ahead and measured the urine and the poo values in cows, pigs, and chickens. And so this is, you're probably going to have to freeze this or, take a screenshot of this, because I don't know if you'll find it anywhere else. It's really hard to come by, but it breaks it down between raw and dry, and it also breaks it down between poo and pee. And so if you're looking at your soil test and you're seeing, the amount of something that's necessary, and then this chart helps you ballpark anyway, like how many animals you would need in terms of weight, given your square footage, given your nutrient needs. And of course, like, trees need replenishment. So every year, as long as you have a harvest, every year you're needing to replenish that fertility. So this is, to me, one of the closest ways you're going to do it, at least if you're thinking about animals, and in a scientific way. And what was interesting to me is that, of course, like chickens, their pee and poo is all mixed together. And so, like for nitrogen, we always hear like chicken nitrogen is super hot, 1.24. But if you add these up, it's more than chickens, So for pigs, pee and poo is more than chickens. And so that just tells you, or tells me, like, if I have a lot of vigor in the trees already, if I have heavy soils, whatever, and we'll talk about this in a minute, you're going to want to move these pigs often. You don't want to camp them out underneath these trees. This system that I'm talking about to you guys today involves moving these pigs, moving these cows, moving this fowl often. More often, it's not like, this is not tractor farming by any means. You're not farming 1,000 acres in a day. So anyway, I would take a snapshot of this for your future reference, and just helping you to start switching over. The only work you're doing is putting these in and understanding the impact your animals have on your landscape's nutrition and what you're growing and what that needs. You can go from there. All right, so now that we've talked about fertility, well, actually we're going to talk a little bit more about fertility, but I also want to talk about livestock. So we're going to talk about livestock needs, but we're also going to talk about some micronutrients, or maybe some of the other macronutrients, because this is N, P, and K here. And so we're going to talk about some of the other ones that I had on that list. Let me see here. Hold on one sec. Let me go back to this list. So, oh shoot, we're going to talk about boron, and we're going to talk about calcium, and then we're going to talk about just a few other outliers. All right, so for those of you who already have an orchard, I'm not sure how many of you do, and this might be an old overgrown orchard, this might be a young orchard, whatever. My off the cuff, and you want to put livestock in it, because that's what we're talking about. This is silvopasture, or animals with orchards with animals in it is silvopasture. So if you want to put livestock into this orchard, the number one thing I would ask you to consider is, can your trees handle having livestock within the orchard rows? If your diameter, for me, basically what I've found, at least for pigs, is that if the diameter of the tree at the base is 4 inches or more, it's go time for the pigs. They're totally fine. That is keeping in mind that you are going to move them and you will not leave them in there. Second thing to consider is the height of your lowest branches, and you're going to want to consider that, take deer into consideration, and also say you have cattle or something, you're going to want that lowest height to be above that browse line for whatever animal you want to stick in there. And that's just because they'll eat it every time they have an opportunity. It totally depends how you move animals through your system, but it's ideal not to have animals browse all the time, because you need to focus nutrients and focus energy to when you need things to grow. And so keeping it out of browse height is important. Also, you need to consider your tree spacing if you already have an orchard, and the vigor of your trees. So by vigor, I mean like explosive growth. You know, how much growth are these trees putting on in a year? So if you were to go to the terminal bud on a branch, follow it back to where the terminal bud was the previous year, if you have more than like 18 inches of new growth, you've got a pretty vigorous orchard, I would say, overall. That's an average overall new growth on all the branches. 2 feet, maybe 2 feet, 24 inches. You've got a pretty vigorous orchard, and so you're going to want to listen to what I have to say. If your orchard is on sand, you probably have less vigor. Also, if your orchard is commercial from a previous era, it probably has less vigor because of the varieties. All right, so vigor. You can attract it. To me, vigor is the biggest beast to deal with within an orchard. It attracts diseases like fire blight, just because when a branch quickly elongates, the cells pull, and so the cell walls are thinner. And so bacteria and fungus and insects are they can much more easily penetrate those cell walls quickly when you have a lot of growth in a short amount of time. Also, vigor means more vegetative growth and less fruit. And so if your goal is to have nut and fruit fodder, or produce nut and fruits for a business or even for animals, you want to reduce the vigor. And vigor is caused from a lot of water, a lot of nutrients, heavy soils, and then also like no root competition. A lot of times glyphosate strips underneath the orchard tree rows that eliminates all like competition with grasses from the roots. And I think that has a negative thing. I mean, to me that's a negative, especially if you have a vigorous cultivar or species that you are trying to keep in check naturally. So vigor is bacterial for the most part. All right, so hold on one sec. I'm going back here. Okay, so we're going to loop back around to fertility, but right now we're talking about, so the trees are perhaps the trees are over-fertile, meaning they just can access more nutrients in the soil, or there's a lot of water in the soil, or the species itself is very vigorous, and we're putting animals in here. All right, so this is an idea for you guys, is to interplant depending, hold on, this vigor and tree spacing here, use it. So if you have a lot of vigor in your orchard, 2 feet or more of annual growth, and you have animals that you want to run through there, you might want to consider planting more trees within the row. This example here is on 6-foot spacings, and I'll talk about why these trees look so like people who stuck their fingers in electricity sockets and shocked themselves. But there's a lot to it. And so if you interplant more trees, and this is strictly thinking about orchard health and it's thinking about animal health, you know, these trees have a lot to offer. We are so centric on thinking about grasses these days when it comes to livestock that we completely tend to overlook perennial forms of nutrition, like woody perennial forms of nutrition. And so, you know, starting from here, like mulberry is a huge source of calcium. Mulberries are also heavy feeders, and I'll talk about them in a second. Hackberry is also a huge source of calcium and silica. Calcium and silica are very much so needed by apple trees. And oftentimes when we spray calcium or when we put calcium down on the ground, what happens is the tree isn't able to take it up, or it takes it up so slowly. But a lot of the rots in fruits is calcium derived. And so these trees need more, apples and many other trees actually need more calcium. And so like mulberries and hackberries, they've got it. Also, I think I've got it, yeah, we'll move on to, I'll talk about this in a second. Boron is another essential nutrient for cropping. And we talked about juglone and walnut. It's a natural wormer. It's also helps to repel insects. It doesn't, so it's a win-win, like in an orchard setting, especially. And you might be thinking, but I thought you can't plant walnuts, you know, next to fruit trees or whatever. And we're keeping it juvenile here forever. The mature effects of, so anyway, we're dwarfing the walnut. And I don't think that's going to be a problem, but there needs to be like scientific studies done on this stuff just to prove what I'm saying today. All right, so all this new growth coming off of these. Also, it's important to keep these trees short. I would fence them out. If you had animals go eating the grass between these tree rows, I would fence them out just so we can focus on achieving great growth out of these what they're pollarded trees. But in keeping them short, you are reducing humidity. You're basically not affecting any like wind flow through the orchard, which is not increasing humidity any, which is also keeping your fungal pressure lower. Just because you've got good airflow. So I think you can have more trees within the tree rows. Also, you're getting more diversity. Some of this fodder, this leaf fodder, has higher protein. And if you were to cut this, which I can discuss briefly in a minute, if you were to cut this, let the animals eat the leaves off. The ramial wood, if any of you are readers of Michael Phillips, he goes into ramial wood quite a bit. What's left behind is ramial wood, and so that feeds mycorrhizae and saprophytic fungi, and so you're just bringing about a more holistic way of orcharding, essentially. All right, so we're going to go one by one with these real quick, except for walnut. We won't talk about walnut because I spent the whole first 10 minutes talking about walnut. All right, so for mulberries, you have 2 options that I would recommend anyway. The first is silk mulberry. In the United States, in the actually like as early as the 1600s, new colonists were bringing over Asian mulberries, and with hope of making silk. And really that spread like crazy in the early 1800s. And all up and down the East Coast are old defunct silk mills. And around those areas are old Asian silk mulberry cultivars that are hiding in the landscape. What's so important about this is that silk mulberries were bred for a higher protein content because they are the only diet of the silkworm. And so silkworms have like a very high protein need, and they also have, they need the leaf to be really digestible. And so like the fiber content needs to be lower, and they need to have a whole smattering of micronutrients. So essentially, and it's 7,000 years old, the silk industry. So like in breeding for silkworms for 7,000 years, they really got it down to the mulberries that produce amazing food. I mean, better than alfalfa. And so that's something that we really need to bring back, and something that I am wholeheartedly invested in is trying to bring back mulberry into the landscape and give it a better, basically just make it a better plant, because a lot of people really poo-poo it, and it's dumb to poo-poo it. The other option are the everbearing mulberries, Hicks, Stubbs, Illinois, Queen Luscious, and more. You can put these in. Mulberries will fruit on first or second year wood, and so it just depends. And so you can keep them low. You could probably keep them low and in between your trees, and have some fruit and have something crop in the first year. But you might also want to think about just mulberry tree rows in general. With mulberry cultivars like Hicks and Stubbs, they'll drop from, it depends on where you are. If you're in the deep, deep south like Louisiana, you're looking at like late April through August, or through middle of August. If you're looking like where I am, Zone 7A, it's like June 1st through the third week of July. And so basically the hotter it gets, the longer they're going to crop. And so Hicks and Stubbs are known for being prolific bearers. And I have Hicks, I believe I have Stubbs, and I have a handful of trees that actually grafted, maybe a few hundred that I will be advertising here shortly on my website, HogTree.com. There's also new ones coming to the landscape, Illinois Queen Luscious and some other fruit explored mulberries from East Tennessee, thanks to Taylor Malone, who is a evergreen mulberry sleuth. All right, also mulberries, I mentioned this before, they have huge amounts, they have calcium in them. And the reason for this, and this is pretty crazy, is that in mulberry leaves, they have idioblasts, which are calcium crystals. So calcium crystals actually exist within each mulberry leaf. And if a little fun fact is that, like with red mulberry, our native mulberry, if you touch it, it's really tomentose, and so it feels hairy kind of, or woolly. That woolliness is actually the tip of the idioblast protruding from the leaf surface. But with Morris alba, so white mulberry or the Asian mulberries, that idioblast top has been recessed just a bit, and so you won't feel that same woolliness. But this is just going to show you, like, so your fruit trees need calcium. I know a tree that can do that for you. And also your animals can, it'll pass through the digestive system of the animals. So this is something to really think about for the future, is deriving calcium from mulberries and incorporating it into your silvopasture and orchard needs. All right, the next thing I mentioned was boron. In order to have a good crop set, you need boron. Boron is limiting in most trees, and so 2 trees to consider for, once again, this sort of scheme here for boron would be sugar maple and sycamore. Sycamore is, there's also a European form of sycamore. They call them plane trees. Those are highly taught to be pollarded, which is I'll go into that a little bit more, but they're highly trained for pollarding, so you can do that, and they'll be fine. Sugar maples, you can't do it in the winter, that's for sure, because they'll just start leaking sap all over the place. And so you're looking at sugar maple as like a late season, or maybe a late summer infusion of boron into the soil via your livestock and whatnot. And then like hackberry, and just, folks, this is just to say, like, this is a new frontier, like waiting to be tapped. We have so many native tree species, especially on the East Coast. We have so many native tree species, and even non-native tree species and bush species that they have so much to offer in terms of livestock nutrition and in terms of soil health and in terms of diversity and bloom schemes and everything. Like, we really got to start playing with this, especially if you're going to use livestock and you're going to be in there anyway. So hackberry is super high in silica, like amazing amounts in the leaves in both June and October. And so depending on I'll talk about pollarding in a minute. There's different harvest schemes that go along with pollarding, but also it's super high in calcium, like very high in calcium. And then a whole smattering of trace minerals as well. This is the fruit, by the way, which is also, you know, if you let it produce fruit, the fruits are not bad. And I find that birds, and even if late season, like dead of winter, pigs would eat the hackberries with glee. All right, so I talked about fertility. This is all a very quick crash course. I could talk about this sort of thing all day. But if you don't have an orchard and you're listening in, one of my major ways of going about this, because I am landless, I lease land from a couple places, is to find an old defunct orchard and topwork it, completely renovate it. And I have a quick movie about topworking that I'll play right after this slide. But yeah, so it's basically changing over the tree from one variety to another. This is how you can implement your drop scheme if you would like, and you're looking at getting fruit in about 2 years. But keep in mind, this is a lot of work, and I mean a lot of work. You're going to need help dragging branches out of the orchard. You're going to have bonfires, or somebody who's, this orchard hasn't been sprayed in a long time, you're going to want to have, try and sell the wood for smoking or whatever, but it's a lot of work. It's very important to check for lead arsenic in your soils. This was the prevailing insecticide that was sprayed on orchards, basically like from 1911 through, I think it's in some states even like up until 1980, they were spraying it. It is not good. It stays in your soil forever. And if you have an animal like pigs, I would highly recommend not leasing that orchard if you want to grow pigs, because they will consume the lead arsenic. It'll get in their organs. It could ruin you if anybody were to have that meat tested. And so perhaps grazing animals would be better. There are studies that say that's not the case. There's studies that say that's fine. So the jury's sort of out. Okay? And quickly, and just to say for top working, I would recommend if you have Bradford pears in your landscape, don't plant them, just top work them. But this also works for apples, it works for persimmons, it works for just about anything you can name. This method works. It just depends on the timing. I might speed it up a little bit. Here we go. All right, this is me making cuts.
Hi, Eliza. Katie here. We have about 3 minutes till the end of the hour.
Okay, that should be fine. Okay. So I'll just show you, I won't play this whole video, but I'll show you, this is basically the whole premise of top working. Got to make sure that the bark is slipping, which for Bradford pear, most trees it starts slipping in like, in my area, it's slipping in maybe early April, and then it goes through the summer. But you're going to want to do this by the middle of May at the latest, I would say. All right, and just to speed this up, I wrap this with tape, electrical tape, and then I put a paint on top. I used a pruning sealer in this video, but usually I'll use something that's a mixture of like, either I'll use Doc Farwell's or I'll use an exterior latex paint mixed with a waterproof wood glue. All right. Tools to help me, I use movable fencing, I use the Premier hog netting. You can use step-in posts and polywire, that's fine too. I use a 3-joule charger, a deep cycle marine battery. I always have 2, one that's on the charger and one that's out in the fields. And grounding rods, get the ones with a slide hammer. Oh my God, this will save you, this is genius here. This you can order from Kincove, it's like 19 bucks, it's worth it, get 2. They save me. This is a quick on how to pollard. Pollarding is also known as permanent renewal. You can keep a tree juvenile for its whole life. This is a way for you to get lots of leaf fodder, usually at least once, but probably twice, maybe sometimes even 3 times if you get good at it, a year. Move your pigs often. If you have pigs, move them often. This is to avoid compaction, especially if you have a lot of rain. You're going to want to move them even faster, sometimes 2 times a day if it's raining. Okay. Any questions? I don't know if I can see sorry, everybody's going to see my screen here. I don't know if I can actually see the questions.
I can read them to you.
Okay.
Here in the chat box. So first question was, how long do you keep your pigs in your orchard? And what size paddocks do you use?
It totally depends on the weather. So if it's a lot of rain, they're in a lot less. I might even have like a reserve paddock for them if it just keeps on raining like it did last year that they can tear up. But you'll have to watch the other presentation. It is truly a per pig per pound per square foot, what I talked about earlier today, or earlier in the presentation that I started deriving my data from.
You have another question about pollarding, and what time of year do you pollard, and do you do it every year?
So it depends on what your goals are, but if you're wanting fodder for the pigs or for chickens or cattle or whatever, you can do a winter pollard, which sets the stage for what's going to be growing. So you're basically like recharging the roots so that they're going to have brand new growth to grow into come spring. And it depends on what species, but you could do 2 cuts in a year. At the very least, though, you could get a late summer cut, probably when you most need it, or even a fall cut. Like right now, we're cutting a bunch of ailanthus for the cattle. walnuts, Osage orange, things like that, that you can cut that late fall, no problem, late summer, no problem. But it really isn't, how often you cut is really a relationship that you need to make with your weather and your species and whatever. But you can at least get one cut per year. With mulberry, they've been designed to be cut several times, but there's like 1,000 different ways to do it, and you should just stay tuned in the future for me to try and teach that to people.
Are you feeding that fodder fresh, or are you drying any for winter feeding?
I mostly just feed it fresh, especially for pigs, because I don't want to keep pigs over the winter if I can deal with it. So yeah, I'll feed it fresh, and it's so satisfying to feed it fresh. But there are people who are making tree hay and putting it up. It's just a lot of work, and it needs major mechanization that some people are working on, but it's not hit my landscape just yet.
Question on how to control vigor to increase fruit production.
Increase fruit, yeah. So like that comes down to cultivar. And so like for an apple, for example, like a spur-bearing apple, a spur is like a little shootlet kind of. If spurs are covering your tree, those are all going to produce fruit, which ultimately lower the vigor. But if there's also some like other ways you can try to get a tree to fruit, but it's a delicate balance because you need a return fruit set the next year. And so if you overcrop one year, you're probably not going to knit much the next year. And so the goal there is balance and trying to figure that out. But yeah, if you feel like you can get something to fruit, if you know how to make something fruit, then do it to reduce vigor. But I don't think it's that easy.
Ben asked, regarding the nutrient accumulating trees, do you think that planting them next to the trees that are deficient is enough, or must the leaves be eaten by the animals and the nutrient deposited in the manure?
It's probably enough. Like from a ramial chip perspective, like, you know, maybe you come through with a grinder, you know, like a little teeny tiny wood chipper or whatever, and run them through if you wanted. But I think like that's just expediting the breakdown, basically. And so it's just a matter of how you incorporate it into the soil, whether it's by animal or it's by wood chipper, or you just leave it and spray like probiotics or whatever on, you know, you spray something on it to accelerate the microbial breakdown, whatever, you know, it's something to play with.
I have a question as someone who is doing a lot of in-row maintenance right now between trees. When you're planting those in-row tree plantings in between apples, how are you maintaining anything that's coming up on the ground, if it's not just grass, if you're having any weed issues in there? Has that been a problem with you?
Yeah. So if you're talking about establishment, then yeah, you got to figure out a way. You know, usually I do that with wood chips, and like right now I use tree tubes. I raise the tree tubes up a little bit off the ground to have a convection current that works, but I basically use wood chips to suppress the weeds. And then once they're established, I pretty much rely on wood chips until the trees are old enough and big enough around to allow livestock in. But hollarding in itself widens the tree trunk. It expedites the widening of the tree trunk as well. So it makes it look much older than it is.
Well, thank you so much, Eliza, for that amazing presentation. I learned a lot, and I know folks did too who are joining us. So for those of you who want to watch this later, there's a lot of really amazing resources. You can find this on our YouTube channel, and I'll send out a link to that when it's done. And that email will also have a link to the evaluation for this evening. We're always looking to improve and make these better for others. Just a quick shout out to please join us at our annual perennial farm gathering at the Cincinnati Mound Center. Eliza is going to be presenting there, so you can glean even more amazing info from her. And it's just one of the most amazing gatherings of folks who are interested in this. So Eliza, thank you so much again, and we'll see you in December.
All right. Thank you.